Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It's this is the Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for March 25th, 2021. Please remember our code of conduct here and treat each other with respect. And let's get started. First item on our agenda is from Laura, and I believe you've got co-host, so you can present, so take it away.
I'm taking it away. All right, so I'm going to present here. So should be full screen for everybody. Hopefully everyone can see. Hello, I'm Laura. I'm visiting from SIG Multi-Cluster. Brought my posse with me. So Jeremy OT is on the call, chair of SIG Multi-Cluster. Paul Mori is on the call, also a chair of SIG Multi-Cluster. And then what I want to talk about today is a KEP that SIG Multi-Cluster has been working on about cluster ID. So also on the call, David Eads is our production readiness reviewer for that. And I think that's everybody who I'm rolling with today. So just FYI, brought some of my friends. So basically, I want to go through just a couple slides to keep everything straight. It's just like sort of 5 minutes and then open up for discussion. Basically, the situation is that SIG Multi-Cluster is working on this cluster ID KEP, which is related to this MCS API KEP. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them and explain why we need both of them. And motivate a little bit that something we've run into in the SIG, that this cluster ID thing that we've been working on seems to have some more utility outside just the bounds of SIG Multi-Cluster, and bring up that there's been kind of like this timeline inside the SIG where we've been talking about, should we implement this as a CRD, which was our original design? Should we try and put this in as a core API as a result? So I have a few notes about what SIG Multi-Cluster thinks about that. But then I'm going to actually open up the discussion generally, even from the base assumption, like, is this even a problem we need to be worried about? And then kind of like tier down from there and see what SIG Arch thinks about this in general. So just to give a little background on what we're talking about, in SIG Multi-Cluster, there's kind of two big KEPs we're working on. Well, one super big KEP that we're working on and one that's related to it. So KEP 1645, the Multi-Cluster Services API. This is a KEP to describe how services can be shared between multiple clusters, right? So there's two implementations and one in progress based on this API. But the KEP itself still needs a few more pieces, and one of those pieces is cluster ID, particularly for the purposes of multi-cluster DNS, which I'm going to briefly go over in a second. So this KEP 2149, this is the one that I'm working on and kind of advocating right here today, but it's very close to this other KEP. It's a blocker for this other KEP is why I bring that up. And this one's still in provisional status. We have a PR open to put it into implementable status as we get all of our final reviews through. And by design right now, since we're from SIG Multi-Cluster, right, it targets known multi-cluster use cases. So in the KEP, we talked about multi-cluster logging and debugging, and we talked about multi-cluster DNS. So those are the things that we as SIG MC are, of course, worried about. And in particular, the meat of it is that it proposes this CRD called cluster property. We had a survey, and that was the thrilling original name that we came up with for what this is. So just to briefly show you what this CRD looks like, it's very basic in general. Really, these objects just have a value. The idea is to provide some type of generalized storage for any arbitrary properties about a cluster. And in particular for SIG-MC, there's these two properties we need to have that we think should go in here: the cluster's name and the cluster set that the cluster is in. So like the name of the multi-cluster group that this cluster is a member of. So this is the way that we think that might look. We have some stuff in the KEP that describes that the name of the cluster should be in a cluster property object that has a metadata name id.k8s.io and might have a value like this. This is a kube system NS namespace UUID, but it could be banana or it could be like my favorite cluster, whatever. But this is our recommendation. And then the cluster set.k8s.io object should be the name of the cluster set. So this might be Environ1, or it might be some specific way that MCS API implementation is tracking cluster set names. So super brief on this one, but one of the things that multi-cluster needs, like SIG multi-cluster needs this for, is to handle multi-cluster DNS. So the whole thing about the MCS API is we're trying to make services accessible from like different clusters that are all in the same environ. So we have a proposal out also about handling multi-cluster DNS. And kind of the big case that I want to highlight here where this cluster name shows up for us is that, and when we want to make a DNS name for headless services, if there's a headless service over in cluster A that has the hostname 1, if there's a headless service over in cluster B that has hostname 1, we want to be able to disambiguate it still with DNS. And so we intend to inject this cluster ID in the middle, in between the host name and the service name in the situation of multi-cluster headless services. So all of that's kind of background about why multi-cluster thinks this is important. But something that has come up, and this is what I really want the insight from SIG architecture about, is that we've started to get some information from other SIGs, and then just like a feeling from various people in our own SIG that this would be useful outside of multi-cluster. So a couple pieces of evidence that have collected over the time here. There was actually, and maybe everybody here already talked on this thread, there was a thread in SIG architecture group in 2018 about cluster ID. This is actually where, as far as I know, where lore-wise, where the idea of using the cube system namespace UUID as a cluster ID kind of first came to as an idea. And in the process of working on this KEP, I went to talk to SIG cluster lifecycle, particularly the cluster API working group, about if they need something like this. It turns out that they do. It also turns out that they implemented something on their own to kind of handle the situation that they needed right now, but that they would prefer to use something centralized, kind of more official. In their case, they're using annotations on the node resource in their namespace. And then in the process of talking to Cluster API, also heard from someone on the virtual cluster project who also need something along these lines. So it started to seem like there were other people who might need this too. So as a result, this conversation started going on. So should we make this a CRD, or should we try and pursue putting this as a core Kubernetes API? Is this something that, there's kind of this general sense in the SIG architecture thread that it should be somewhere, core, but I don't know if that's necessarily, what we feel now. I'll come back to this slide later if we want to look at it, but basically we have an understanding in SIG MC of what the pros and cons, one side or the other, would be. But of course, this whole chart is predicated on the assumption that we do want it to be ubiquitous and have a default always set. And that's, why we would like the yes side versus the no side of a pro con list here. So happy to take any questions on any of the stuff I just went over. I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page, but this is the slide of the real questions that I have for SIG architecture and would like to open the discussion. So kind of step one, I feel, is whether we agree that a cluster local representation of a cluster's name should be consistently available in Kubernetes clusters. So we're kind of like operating under this assumption as we've been talking to people, but that's kind of the baseline assumption that everything else falls out of. So I want to open the discussion for that. And then if so, is this API that we are suggesting, this cluster property kind, something that would fit the bill for that? And then everything else falls out of that too. So, is there a world where we can plan for a cluster ID being guaranteed to be set? Like, could we run Kube API server with some sort of flag that always sets this cluster property to like maybe the Kube system namespace UUID, right? This is more like details, but like, is there a world we would want to go towards that's something like that? And if we're going in that direction, what does this mean for where we choose to implement the API? And in particular, as far as we don't know that there is any migration path to go from something that started out as a CRD and then actually gets into core. So that's why we think this is relevant to discuss now. And that's what I want to know.
All right, thank you, Laura. So my initial reaction to any new thing is thinking CRD, but actually after hearing your presentation, I mean, I'll offer my opinion, for whatever that's worth, that this seems like a very, that the value of this is about identity, or at least in part, and having a place to store general cluster properties seems like an appropriate thing for a core API. One of the issues we discussed a long time ago here was that we don't have any facility, and I believe this is still true, and David may be able to say something. We don't have any facilities sort of to automatically load CRDs in a sort of default manner, and so that adds to a lot of complexity in HA setups for creating your bootstrapping your cluster, basically. So making it a built-in really helps alleviate some of those concerns as well. So I will yield my time. David has a hand raised.
Yeah. So just a couple comments on the comparison table that you have. It passed up really quickly. I do want to mention that as a CRD, you can still be in the K8s.io API group if you choose to be, and that will still require the API review process. So
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
That's a distinguishing feature. I mean, I guess you could choose not to be, but if you are looking for sort of that official stamp, then I think that it's appropriate, even as a CRD, to be in the K8s.io API group.
Just to be clear, David, when you say API group, you mean that suffix. You don't literally mean K8s.io. You mean something K8s.io.
Yes, I do mean that suffix.
Just for the record.
Yes, for the record. And for the record, I do believe Tim is an approver, so I don't think it's a very high bar for you, but I do want to make sure that's reflected here on this chart. I had another question about functionality. Is there any actual shortcoming of CRDs that are known that prevent this other than your deployment capabilities? Are there actually functional gaps in the CRD API that would prevent this from being a CRD?
So I don't think there's any functional gaps, particularly from the purview of what we have proposed for the purposes of SIG multi-cluster. I think where it becomes questionable to us is really in the space of, do we want to, as a larger architecture idea in Kubernetes, have this available more broadly? So I think for the MCS API implementation, and feel free anybody else to hop in from SIG MC2, the language in the KEP is very like, if you are an MCS API implementation, you must follow XYZZ, things about how this sets up. So that puts the burden on the implementations for MCS API in that case. And I don't think the CRD infrastructure itself blocks that implementation, but obviously then that becomes the pain of the MCS API, I guess, but that is something we can accept if we want.
I think the bootstrapping thing, David, that I mentioned, and the fact that you would want some default set sort of at cluster creation time is something you can easily do with a CRD. So every client has to rely then upon, it has to have the logic to notice that there isn't one and either fail or generate one in some way.
I had one other comment on this with regard to the ubiquity and the always available. And I'm interested in what distinguishes this from other APIs that are CRDs, right? So I have, those basically seem to be true for every API and would be true of things that people are looking at in, say, SIG auth projects around resources for describing policy, right? And policy auditing capabilities. I guess I'm looking to say, like, is there some line we can draw here that says this one is different than the other CRDs that we've seen? Because in those cases, John, everyone faces the exact same issues, and I believe they've managed to make it through without tremendous.
Yes, that's true. It's just, I mean, I think this is sort of a fundamental property of a cluster is being able to identify. But it's a valid point. I don't want to dominate here. We do have other hands, and so if you're okay, David, that's a good point. I think let others.
I am. And hopefully one of these other hands has an opinion and can help us find that line.
All right. Dims is next, and then Clayton.
Yes, thank you. So me and Nikita have been talking about the bootstrap problem, and we might have something we are Nikita is prototyping something that we can bring to this team here. So that should help with this problem of, do we need to do it as a CRD or does it need to be built in? Basically, if we allow people to load the CRDs when the API server comes up by, say, using the GoBin data embed stuff, or a command line parameter to add more CRDs, that would help with this. The other twist here is like, how do we populate the default value to it? I haven't thought about that one yet, but we can talk about that a little bit. But I do want to say that this KEP would go well hand in hand with what Nikita is prototyping, and use that as a thing to like get support for the Bootstrap problem into Kubernetes really soon. That's that's my hope with this. Back to you.
Clayton had the next hand.
Yeah, I didn't know if Laura wanted to answer any of those points.
Gotcha. I do want to hear. I do think it's interesting that there's this other work going on about making CRDs bootstrappable. So I think we definitely should sync up and see where the overlaps are there. But yeah, I don't know exactly the details of that, but as you had just mentioned, if we want like a situation I'm thinking about is if Cluster API definitely wants to use this and MCS definitely wants to use this, but we offload the setting of the default to an MCS controller implementation, then now anytime Cluster API wants to use this, the cluster has to have the MCS controller installed, right? So I think figuring out if we can have that default value set thing happening more generally, and again, whether that's part of the work that's going on with the CRD installers or not, is an interesting point. Clayton, go ahead.
Sure. So there's a couple elements of this. Actually, I'm a little concerned about tying too many of these elements together too early, because like the point of an API is that it has a consumer. The API means something. Cluster claim, I think, makes sense from this cluster belongs to this. It has a well-known name. It's a singleton. You're making a statement in that API that this means something, and the consumer has a meaning, and there might be other consumers, right? So if the if a controller off cluster is looking at it and saying, I look at this cluster, I know what it means, I know who it is saying it is, that's still not the same thing as the actual unique identifier of the cluster. It's just a convention that they both overlap. I get a little uncomfortable for that, because in the use case of cluster claim, you could actually have other types of systems where you say a cluster actually has two different names that are imposed at the higher level. They both map to something underlying. Someone might actually have a different API for cluster claim that we wouldn't, eliminate it. They can go do that today. There's nothing that stops them. When you have to create the cluster claim that has a specific meaning and that has a bunch of behavior on the other system, I get a little nervous about that, because I agree with the use cases that a cluster should have an identifier. That identifier should mean something. I'd probably like to keep those more orthogonal, but have a clean way for someone like you say to say, like, this is what the cluster's idea is. It should propagate. I don't think they have to be the CRD necessarily. They could. The way controllers are booted kind of leans towards that. So that part's a little uncomfortable. There's also a disclosure aspect to this, which is if we create it by default, we put it on the cluster, that may actually be information that's confidential to an operator. And so like Derek's question about downward API, like I could see that potentially having a few impacts, which is, yeah, sure, you got to protect it with RBAC, but then if it shows up silently in events and someone forgets and puts it in an event, that's another thing that might actually disclose some information that the end user might not actually be privileged to. So a few wrinkles around like that. I like the idea, the orthogonality of the different pieces was just a little like, it felt we were coupling too early, and we could maybe have two things that mostly work together and then work towards maybe automating them more over time would be a little bit more my comfort.
So I'll relay for Derek first, and then I'll ask my questions or say what I want to say. Derek asked a couple of questions in the chat. One was, do you see this as a mutable API? As a mutable API, to be clear.
So we've talked about this a little bit in the SIG and the KEP. If for example, a cluster is unregistered from a cluster set, then we effectively delete this object for that cluster, and then they could re-register even under the same name. And that's the operation that actually makes them be able to have a different cluster set value. So I guess that another way, no, in the sense that we expect these to be deleted and re-registered as when they're edited, but they are repeatable.
But I think
does that answer your question?
If you didn't see it in chat, because you probably didn't see it in chat, Derek's question was specifically thinking about like backups, right?
Clusters backup and restore must it be preserved.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we have talked about this a little bit in SIG MC2, and I think dodged it a little bit, but I think the answer to this is that it doesn't need to be. So that cluster itself will have a cluster local representation of its name and of its cluster set. And then if it is actually truly part of a cluster set, like this outside reconciler is going to be trying to resolve whether that cluster can really join under that name or not. And I think that's where that starts to, that's where this gets enforced if there is a cluster backup and restored with a certain name, but in the meantime, some other cluster took the same name in the same cluster set.
So
did that's actually anything?
That's important, Laura. I think you're implying the source of truth for this idea for a cluster claim is not in the cluster. And I think that is an important distinction.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of points here. And again, me coming from SIG multi-cluster, these are very related to each other. But the cluster name itself, ideally, we would like it, especially if we're going this trend of it being generally useful and available and default, et cetera, be unique beyond the properties of, beyond the bounds of a cluster set. But as we've talked about it to date, it has a relationship in the sense that a cluster can only join a certain cluster set if it has a unique name inside that cluster set. So if this cluster was called Banana and it joined Banana cluster set, and then some other cluster tried to say their name was Banana and joined the Banana cluster set, they either can't join the Banana cluster set, or they can once they change their name away from Banana.
So just to be clear, name and ID are interchangeable in your discussion?
Yes, sorry. I'm not being very precise with my terminology here, but yes.
So if Derek had a second question, but I would like to get to it in a roundabout. If I can just remind the group and the record of some of the history here. We added a cluster name field to object meta, ostensibly to handle this-ish problem. And then as a group, we decided never to use it. And there's code somewhere in the REST path that says cluster name must be empty and blasts it with an empty string. A lot of the reasoning there was we just couldn't drive consensus on how the cluster name came into the cluster and who gets to set it. Was it mutable? Was it a UUID? Was it a human-friendly string? Does it change? Are there aliases to it? And at that point, we kind of punted, honestly. We just didn't solve this problem. But we agreed that coming in, being able to read it at that level was not the important part. We did discuss passing a flag into like a controller manager or API server rather, and saying this is your cluster's name, change it at your own risk, right? And being a flag, you know, is unlikely to get changed very often. And that was one way that we could have gotten that particular datum. But this API is sort of the hyper generalized form of that, right? Because it's not just the cluster identifier that can be stored in one of these cluster properties, right? We can store other information in them, which is an interesting way, I think, to assert information about the cluster from the administrator or provider's point of view. One thing that this is missing, and I know Laura's probably tired of hearing me say it, but at some point we will need to deal with like validating like a signature on these, right? Like as a hosted provider, I would like to be able to make an assertion about the cluster that lives within the cluster that I can then validate that it was in fact me who made it, right? Because we don't have a concept really of truly immutable immutable APIs. As for downward API, which was one of the things that Derek asked, my feeling of downward API is, it's the confused deputy's confused deputy. So like not adding it to downward API and instead saying this is an RBAC governed thing is useful. RBAC for specifically named resources does exist. So, we can encourage people to use that if they need to. Last point to the question of ubiquity and auto-loading CRDs. The last time we had a discussion about auto-loading CRDs, it kind of came to a dead end, and I'm partly guilty for that, of just having gotten busy and not having found consensus on it. So I'm super eager to hear, Dims, what you've got up your sleeve, and Nikita. I'm not sure that ubiquity should be a first goal. Like if we're going to push for an API to be used here, I would rather we make a separate cap for how do we get really ubiquitous usage of it. And I see some stuff in the chat, so I will yield my time.
I think this is from Clayton. I also kind of was reading your chat. I'm typing and reading chat at the same time. But yeah, I think the point about the source of truth being external for multi-cluster services, that's really only relevant to the cluster set, a cluster set name, the clusterset.k8s.io value in its relationship to a cluster local's representation of its own cluster name. So they're very connected for me, but in reality, the cluster ID can be centralized, and it's only when it has to react to other clusters in the situation of multi-cluster API that we have a definition of how it should behave externally. But you have another hand, so go ahead, Clayton.
Yeah, it's like Tim dredged up a whole bunch of like history for me too, because having
bring on the lore, people.
Like we always kind of took so if Brian were here, Brian would be like maximum orthogonality, like good orthogonal APIs work great. That's partially why I brought that up, but also like it lets people react and put the systems together. We've started to we've been more opinionated about deployment, but we still we have a cautious line, like kubedmin is a default and it's reasonable, and we try to drive consensus on deployment patterns. We have KEPs for that. I think there's a very useful, I really do agree that the idea of all of the things we talked about that are internal to a cluster, like Kube has a name for what this is, that is used in the systems that have to go connect. It's a hard problem. It feels like it deserves its own topic and discussion, and maybe we just run aground on it. I actually would probably argue it feels like, I don't know that, just given the scope of Kubernetes today, if everybody has to have a cluster ID and it's always immutable and it's always per cluster, there's so many different things that it's going to touch that driving it through would either oversimplify and close the door for some flexibility down the road, or it would lead us into places where we get halfway down and then realize that we got to stop. And so having a nice cluster claim seems awesome. Most people from sanity perspective would love to set a cluster ID that shows up in the logs and diagnostics or audit, especially. This is a great field to go and audit. And if we could figure out a way to line up each of those so that they overlap where they need to, they touch loosely, and that it's very natural to use them in the same way, that sounds awesome. I do worry about you create a CRD that we embedded in the project, and then a bunch of things read, and then we realize halfway down, we're like, oh, we didn't actually want that to be the same for this use case. That was mostly what the orthogonality, even Tim's points, all of this is it's good. Each of these individually is good. Putting them together too soon. We should just try to figure out how to line them up just so they touch where they need to. If you reasonably set a cluster ID in KubeAdmin, you have a reasonable expectation that you can use it with a cluster set in this. And if you reasonably look at your audit logs, you could reasonably have it. How do we line that up with the loosest possible coupling as some identifier? I'm a little concerned about cluster property, which is cluster property is like the XML problem, which is you can have XML subnodes that have actual structure, or you stick everything as an attribute, which can't, which is always like you get one or the other, but not both. You can have structure or you can have consistency, but you can't have both at the same time. We have CRDs and we have config maps. Cluster property feels like a different kind of config map, and at least for validation and signatures, there's an argument of, are we just not doing enough to support use cases that config maps we care about, like sign config maps? So that was a side separate topic. Again, maximum orthogonality. Could you use an existing concept effectively? We use config maps to carry data.
So once upon a time, we talked about, should we have an in-cluster cluster object and use that as the sort of schematized version. And then we don't have any API machinery for like singleton resources. And so we had to deal with, well, it's NRE whether we like it or not, right? And so I think cluster claim has a nice property there that its natural N-ariness is a useful property. But I do hear your point, Clayton. Config maps aren't that different, although we don't have cluster scope config maps. I find it interesting and useful to sort of assert but not enforce that a cluster property is a single value and should be a single data point. People who want to bend it will find ways to bend it, but we can encourage people to say like this is supposed to be one thing. I still like the object meta cluster name field, and I think it would be really useful to return some information on every API object, and I think it gives an interesting way to start to build more multi-cluster APIs, right? Like we use the namespace field to route within a cluster. I could use the cluster name field to route within a cluster set, right? Like that, I think that's an interesting property. It's unexplored. I would be happy to reopen that can of worms if I thought that there was actually a path forward on cluster name as a distinct thing. So, if anybody feels like that's its time has come, like that, I think it's orthogonal to cluster property overall, because cluster property is useful as a generalized form, but maybe promoting cluster name to be a very specifically special thing that we embed in object meta, I could get behind.
Well, and just to add to that, Tim, like the idea that there's a cluster name that shows up in object meta and a field that shows up in logs and a cluster claim, they're all names. The requirements for cluster name or cluster claim include DNS. The requirements for logs might include uniqueness and differentiation, and the requirements for cluster name and object meta might be clarity for end users. Similar, have overlapping properties. Is it worth it forcing them all to be the same? I think would be the key question. Is they feel related and important to get consistent where possible, but not forced too hard.
Yeah, one of the things that we discussed early on with the cluster claim, cluster property, was like if we can't get people to agree on the globally or non-globally uniqueness of a built-in name, let's just give them some guidelines and tell them what we're going to do with it, and then give them the responsibility of doing the right thing with it, right? So one of the things that we really swirled on when we talked about using cluster name, metadata.cluster name before was, well, some people will need it to be globally unique. So let's enforce it to be globally unique, in which case it's just a UUID, and we already have UUIDs, they're attached to objects. So let's just create an empty object and use that UUID. But that's super not useful in DNS. Like, I'm not sure I want to see, foobar.xml XYZ 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dash 7, 8 dash 1, you know, that's not helpful. So then we swirl on aliases again, right? And we're back to, oh my gosh, we got more than one of these things. So one of the things I really liked about the cluster property proposal that Laura is putting forward is it's optional and it tells you how we're going to use it, and it lets you decide if you want to put banana in there, like that's on you. If that's unique enough for you, bully, and if it's not, then you can do something else.
So if I can summarize a little bit recently, what I'm kind of hearing is definitely people feel like there is utility for a cluster name. There has long been a utility for a cluster name in various situations that is cluster local. There's this meta.cluster name that was discussed before and abandoned because we couldn't all agree on the point that we may want to rebuild potentially in tandem with this initiative, because that may solve certain subsets of use cases and maybe is more strict than what the CRD we're proposing on the cluster property side is, to Clayton's point. And then this CRD could fit these other requirements, including that multi-cluster needs something that can be a label in DNS.
So the original part of the original question that we haven't really addressed at all in all of this pontification is, should it be a CRD or should it be a built-in?
Right. I guess we seem to be good on the first one. A cluster local representation of a cluster's name should be consistently available in Kubernetes clusters. I feel like we like that. And then I'm not sure that we've totally agreed that cluster property as described here fits the bill, though we have enumerated some of the nice things about it, particularly in comparison to meta.cluster name from the past. So I think this is where we might be stuck.
To get cluster property to be useful, does everyone have to buy into it? And I'm always cautious about saying everyone has to buy into our net new thing for it to be useful. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try in some cases. Is it just optional that you can set if you want to buy into the schema and we can try it out? Like, it doesn't have to be enforced for us to find, you know, if KubeAdmin sets it, if you know, a couple of clouds set it, if people build stuff around it, as long as it has a good principled design, you don't necessarily have to enforce it to find value. That would be certainly one angle to approach. I would say unless you hard force Kubernetes not to start up without a resource existing, the odds of everyone implementing it within the next couple of years are pretty low. And that does feel like a bit of a, it feels more aggressive than we have historically been on changes, unless they have such clear clear value for everyone in the community that the pain is worth it. And I think that's what the tension is always. Like, these things that get people lined up on conventions are hard, but they are ultimately possible. Like, we got node roll kind of sane after 10, 15 releases. And it is useful, and people use node roll extensively. It shows up in a lot of deployments and a lot of tools and a lot of experiences. So it is possible to make these work over time.
There's some talk in the chat. Derek's talking about, is a cluster name universally unique or unique within a service provider? In our spec right now, it must be unique within a cluster set. Again, very multi-cluster focused. We say it should be unique beyond that boundary. I think the question about whether the service provider is the right boundary, which David also asked after that, is a good question. Like, we wouldn't want to risk collisions on GK and EKS. I think the conversation in SIG multi-cluster is definitely more on the UUID side. If we're going to go for the much more globally unique side and not just hide in the cluster set world, that's what we want. Then the next hand is from Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say that, here's my own version of what I think the sweet spot would be, to just riff a little bit on Clayton. So in the possibility that Clayton just articulated verbally of having something that's optional that maybe a cloud provider or two could enable, folks could enable on clusters they were running themselves without consuming a star KS product, that kind of thing. Where the sweet spot is for me is like in those scenarios, enough utility being derived from it that you would have folks lobbying their star KS provider that didn't enable it because it was so useful, if that makes sense. I think that would be a good place to be, but definitely agree that it's probably a better approach to have like demand side pressure rather than like forcing people to use something. EOF.
Jeremy has a hand next.
Yeah, I think Paul touched on what I was going to say, so I'll skip to that part. But Clayton, I think your last comment about the warm feeling for domain-specific uniqueness is basically how we got to some of these requirements, because like we wanted globally unique in time and space because it felt right, but in terms of actual use cases, like that's really hard and doesn't work for everybody. So within that cluster set for multi-cluster services, it makes sense, and maybe over time, if other projects adopt cluster ID, as a concept, then maybe that expands, and eventually we see so much demand that it should be enabled by default and follow some convention. But I don't think we have enough information to make any statements about that today.
All right, I've got another hand from James.
Yeah. So we can look at this two ways, right? Well, it feels like there are two caps in here, not just one, right? One is about doing something in a cluster that can be used in logs and audit and things like that Clayton was talking about. And the second one is like, how can an external API like MCS or Cluster API be allowed to set and play with the things that are on a specific cluster? Should we separate this into two, or that was basically what was going on in my head.
Did you say the first one was whether this like storage structure exists? And the second one is how?
Yeah, the first one is, okay, there needs to be something in a cluster that needs to be persisted. And then we have this question of like logging and auditing and basic stuff that we need to do for the lifecycle or within a specific cluster, right? So that would be like one set of work that a bunch of people will have to end up doing to make it work well with a single cluster, right? So that would be like one body of work. The other body of work is how can you use the same API from outside to when you're initializing a cluster or running a cluster and then taking care of a cluster from an agency that is outside the cluster. That seems like another body of work, which is where you came from. So I'm wondering if there is a set of people who will be willing to work on the first set of problems.
Okay. Yeah, interesting split for sure. Way to think about this.
So if I can interject here, we're running a long time, and there's at least one other item I would like to get to on the agenda. So if there's any additional, what do we need to do to move to the decision point here?
Great question. I did get a lot of ideas, and I think I get the sense that SIG architecture, I guess generally, if everybody speaking here is representative of this, think that something like a cluster name should exist. And I'm definitely getting the feeling that there's potentially multiple use cases that might want to be separated out a little bit so that it's not all has to be fit into this one thing right now. Is a temperature that I'm getting. And I think I can connect with DIMS about this CRD bootstrapping thing to address like a technical limitation that we have been concerned about on the CRD side. But I'm not sure I totally feel like I have 100% answer otherwise. And I'm not exactly sure how to move that forward. I think most of, though, to be honest, I feel like most of it was emphasizing CRD over core KK at this point. Is what I feel.
Yeah, and in the chat that seems to be. So why don't
I'm late on chat.
No, of course you're talking. How do you read chat and talk? So it sounds like the consensus would be sync up with DIMS, see if we can resolve these bootstrapping issues, and then if that works, we go with CRD, and we move on from there. So thank you, Laura. That was a great discussion, and thank you everybody who participated.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
So I did move some things around on the agenda because there was an item around a proposal for a working group formation, and so Han or whoever it is that wants to talk about that. Lori, I know you have an item on here. I don't think this is actually the enhancements liaison. This is the right forum for that. I think that's a release team concern. We talked about that on Slack, I believe. And Rian, I'm sorry, we'll have to do the sub-project update next 2 weeks because this discussion. And anybody who has hands on this issue, please bring it up on Slack or emailing us because we only have 10 minutes left. Thank you. Please, Han or is it Merrick? Please take over. Or
Sure. Yeah. So this is regarding a working group formation. We blasted it out on the SIG Arch Google group. Specifically, we are proposing forming a working group for the structured logging effort. It was pretty involved in the last release and involved a large number of people across a number of SIGs. And the migration is still occurring. So it seems to make sense to form a working group for this. I don't know how contentious that is.
It's not contentious at all, at least in my mind. Go for it, like, you don't have to.
I guess my only question would be, how many do you clearly you don't expect this all to be done in the next release, right? So it's going to take a couple releases.
It is, yes.
It makes sense. Yeah.
So the only guidance I would give is like what happened in 121. Kubelet was targeted, and a bunch of people like swarmed over it and got it done. So that would be like a good pattern to follow and like hit one after another. Do kubeproxy controller manager. Go in that or go in some order where you can like feel the progress. And full components get moved. That's the only thing I can think of. But Clayton,
I actually wanted to riff on that, Dim. So like there is an element of this is like a working group or something like a channel. Like it seems like a reasonable thing. The feedback loop of we did a component. Is it working? Have we soaked it? Have we absorbed feedback from all the operators? Did structured logging in kubelet accomplish the goals? Did we regress performance? Did we miss logs? Do we need to change our process for next time? That's actually an area which I know in other bits of feedback I've received around structured logging, it's moving just fast enough, and we swarmed kubelet and we changed some stuff that it's right on that edge of like it's introduced change that is impactful, that it might be good to, let's say, like a more formal thing of like, let's gather the feedback and take did we succeed? I'm less concerned about how fast it rolls out than did we nail structured logging, or would we go back and do a second pass on kubelet based on learnings? That was maybe and I saw there's some other summaries in other groups, but that was just in my thought, which is the working group can help be accountable to that, and that's the part of SIG Arch that I would love to hear that feedback on. That would be like an ask.
I think that sounds reasonable. I think Tim had a hand.
Yeah, I like the idea of attacking it component by component, but I would also suggest, well, let me back up and ask a question. Part of the goal when we originally talked about structured logging was to be able to decouple from glog or klog as a specific implementation. Do you think that that is part of this working group's purvey also?
I'll leave that one to Merrick. Merrick, do you want to?
So at the big, when we concepted where the original concept for the group was created was mainly focused on collecting people to do the migration, but I think the finishing doing the polishing touches, so some long-term changes that technically were discussed, like context, removing the Klog, or like changing the Klog to logger, or contextful logging. This is something that the same group would be capable to tackle, like long-term and plan it with the same impact, or like same velocity. So I think I put it in the original charter idea, one of the ideas to tackle them also.
So the reason I ask is I perceive one of the big deliverables that we could land on is to get to decouple all of client Go from Klog. Wouldn't it be nice if somebody could vendor a version of client Go that didn't depend on Klog? And
Like
to do that, right? We don't just need to change client Go, but you need to like find the edge where client Go reaches out into other code and either adapt with an API like Logger or something else, and like seal the edges of that boundary. I think that would be a super awesome delivery. That's one track. The other track would be, I'd love to see somebody tackle like kubeproxy or kubelet and say, it's completely converted to structured logging, and we swapped out Zap for Klog, right? And the logs got faster, right? So, but again, to do that, it's like, because our code is so highly intertwined, there's a lot of ripple there. And so you have to define sort of an edge. I'm supportive of the working group. I would love to see client Go, I think, is like the most return on investment, and then individual components, I think, would be hot on its tail.
Yeah, the main thing to watch out for, Han, here is fatigue and losing out of steam. And that has happened more than once. So getting new people in is definitely a good thing to do, and training them up on like all the things that we've talked about in the past, and giving them context on why we are doing this, not just how and what exactly what you're doing. It would be an important thing to bring additional people into the community, as well as introduction to the code base, and giving them context on what we do here. That's definitely a good thing. But again, to watch out for is fatigue, and be mindful of that, and try to recruit more leaders in the community, so you're not the only one doing this.
Yeah,
and I believe Laurie has offered to help with some organizing some stuff too, right?
She has, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think I raised my hand. My house isn't really noisy right now, so hopefully you can hear me. This is Derek. What does I generally like the idea of the work group. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, what does the working group fix that was felt right now, just so that we can state it back clearly. And one of the things I was wondering is like, does the formation of the work group, are the participants going to be able to like take over dominant approval flow? Like one of the things I wondered when looking at a lot of the structured logging changes was like, man, I wish I could separate the approve on this change by just seeing something that said, literally this PR did nothing but change the log statement and nothing else. And so what I'm wondering is like, I could see that being a part of fatigue in the process. And so what I'm wondering is, what does this work group fix for those who are participating?
Well, we can do two rounds of reviews, right? Like we can do a preliminary working group review and then pass it on to the approvers so that they can basically check it off and sanity check to prevent fatigue from, all the top level approvers.
Okay.
I will say I found some of the review, like it's great how many people have been participating in converting stuff to structured. Some of the reviews were super easy, and some of them I found myself picking a little bit at language, and like, so having some norms around like don't leave a dangling 2 at the end of your message string, because you literally you broke the string and left the I forget what part of the language that is, but the dangling 2s and ands or froms, like that doesn't make for the most useful log, and that's where it sort of got tedious, right? It would be wonderful to just be able to skim through and say, yep, the only thing that changes is log lines, and I completely trust that the working group has owned the grammatical parts of this. Approved.
Okay. Yeah, we can put that stuff into the charter, I think. Should we bring the charter back up to SIG? I know we're running out of time. We have like 2 minutes.
PRs are fine, Han. Just do PR and ping us.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all so much. I guess we're out of time. Lori, I know you said maybe you do want to talk about this here, but let's talk about that offline.
It's all right. Yeah, it's all right.
Okay. All
Thanks.
right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great almost weekend.
You too.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.